Hello, this is a Seek and Prosper interview from S&P Global. My name is Nathan Hunt. I'm joined today by Andy Critchlow. Andy is the Global Head of News at S&P Global Commodity Insights. Andy, welcome.
Hi Nathan. Thanks for having me on the show.
Andy, what I'm hoping to talk a bit about today is geopolitics and commodity and energy markets. Geopolitical turmoil has become something of a theme for the world over the last, call it 5 years, perhaps longer. It seems to have had less of an impact on commodity markets, and that's almost seems not intuitive to me. Why do you see less of an impact there?
Yeah, it's quite paradoxical, isn't it, that you've had probably an unparalleled amount of geopolitics that could potentially impact markets over the last 5 years. So if you just wind the clock back, we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, one of the world's largest exporters, producers of commodities, metals, agriculture, fossil fuels, and widespread imposition of sanctions. You would think huge dislocation in markets, impact on prices. Yes, we certainly did see a big impact on prices in Europe, for example, for gas, a big short-term impact on prices for oil, but then that dissipated very quickly. Trade flows adjusted. At the same time, we've had a huge uptick in geopolitical risk out of the Middle East, attacks on physical infrastructure, hundreds of attacks on shipping in choke points like the Bab el-Mandeb Strait in the Red Sea, actual oil tankers being hit by missiles. In another time, this would have had profound impact on energy prices on a day-to-day basis, but we've seen very little. So, the question's a very good one. Why is this happening when, there's so much volatility potentially around geopolitics? So many risks around whether it's physical attacks to infrastructure, whether it's war risk, whether it's just general political risk in relation to policy. But it's not being necessarily reflected in price. So what's changed? Well, spare capacity is what's changed. So on the one side, if you look at the oil complex, you have OPEC and OPEC Plus, including Russia, which, controls over 60% of global seaborne oil exports, oil on the water at any one time. And OPEC Plus has about 6 million barrels almost of crude per day that it's just idling at the moment. And that's to maintain the price at a level that can basically make their economies tick over. So that's north of $70 a barrel. And that's a big question whether it can. And, the other side of that is, does the low oil price environment, the relatively low oil price environment in relation to their fiscal break-evens, is that feeding into geopolitics? But overall, you still have this big potential glut of supply that could come into the market, which is spare capacity or idled capacity in the context of OPEC. And then on the other side, you have the amazing US oil story, which just keeps on giving. You have the US producing north of 13.5 million barrels a day of crude, a major exporter, world's biggest net producer of hydrocarbons now. Could you have predicted that 25 years ago? Of course not. No one was predicting that. It's one of the huge shifts in the geopolitical story of oil, the policy decisions that took us there. And that story is still playing out at the moment. But what that means is that there's an abundance of potential supply, both in terms of liquid fuels and natural gas, and that's been able, and LNG for that matter. And that's been able to act as a buffer to absorb some of this political uncertainty.
How does an understanding of geopolitical risk help people who are operating in commodities markets today?
I think it's profoundly important, and I say that from my perspective as a journalist who's worked in the field for almost 25 years. I mean, I remember being a reporter on the streets of Iraq in 2003, literally weeks after the US military had reached Baghdad, taken control of the country. The war, in many respects, was about oil and securing those oil resources. The first thing, and I very vividly remember this, that happened when the US reached Baghdad is that they sealed off the oil ministry. They secured the country's ability to administer and operate its oil infrastructure and rebuild. And why did they do that? Because the world's largest economy depends on stable prices for commodities. Geopolitical risk matters now as much, if not more, than it mattered then, because the stakes are higher. And what's affecting that? Well, climate change, peak oil demand. Countries like China, which since 2001, joining WTO, has driven global oil demand, now reaching a peak. So where do producers go for the next growth market? All of this has a profound impact on prices. It has a profound impact on Wall Street, because all of the companies in the S&P 500, in the Dow Jones Industrial Average, oil is a big driver behind their businesses still, and the oil price matters. So understanding the impact of geopolitics on that and the relationship it has with markets is absolutely vitally important, never more so than now.
What are the geopolitical flashpoints that your news team is looking at right now?
So many. The Middle East is a powder keg, as always, but the fuse has certainly been lit. The situation in Lebanon could easily escalate to a wider regional war. The implications of an escalation that would draw in Iran, Israel in open conflict are quite profound. Would that close off major trade routes from the region? It's a good question. Coming back to my initial point around the amount of attacks that we've seen on shipping in the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, and Yemen's ability, or the Houthi militia's ability in Yemen, to actually target physical infrastructure using drones, kind of low-tech technology, has shown us that it is possible to close off some of these choke points. Would Iran seek to do that with the Straits of Hormuz? About 18 million barrels of crude moving through there every day on their way to predominantly markets in Asia. So a wider escalation in the Middle East is something that we're looking at very closely, and the implications obviously that would have on markets. I think the climate change story, you see that in North America at the moment with the floods, is something maybe not near term, but in the medium term we look at very closely. And it does come near term when you have hurricanes, a greater number of chaotic weather events that could affect refineries, production in the Gulf of Mexico, that can disrupt trade flows. Again, this is something that we watch very closely. At Commodity Insights, we've recently pushed into pricing of agricultural commodities. So changing weather patterns can have a very big impact on a day-to-day basis in some of the big producing basins for major commodities, feeding into that sort of food production process. So Brazil, of course, India, Australia, all countries that have been affected by this. And then, of course, we have a major election coming up in the US at the end of the year. The US is still a major driver for the commodities markets globally, whether it's on the production side or whether it's on the demand side. Whoever wins that election at the end of this year will have a big impact on how we see commodity markets developing over the next 4 to 5 years.
Andy, one final question. In terms of geopolitics and commodities markets, frequently what we're dealing with is unintended consequences. And when I think about unintended consequences, I think about the situation in Libya today. We have a very divided country there. There is sort of a government in the East and a government in the West, and they need to work together in order to generate oil revenues. They're coming out of a period of intense disagreement between the two governments. How do you see Libya playing out over time? Is there a way forward here?
I started my career covering Libya in 2000, and that was when the country was ruled by a dictatorship, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. If anyone had asked me at that period, would that regime fall, I would have said no. It had too strong a grip on the country. It had broken the will of the tribes. Politically, it had. It was very difficult to see its downfall, even with sanctions, which made it hard for Libya to export oil at that time. But then sanctions were eased. Mid-2000s, Libya was the largest oil producer in Africa. And then suddenly regime change, complete breakdown of civil society. And now what you have in Libya is essentially two warring factions, possibly more, possibly three warring factions. I find it very difficult to see any orderly outcome coming from that in the next 2 to 3 years. The conflict's very, tribal there. And oil is the ultimate bartering tool for either side. And who's going to give that up? The real tragedy is for the Libyan people and the Libyan economy, which was once one of the wealthiest countries in North Africa, if not the whole of Africa, on the back of its ability to produce oil. And I think that those days are long gone. It's now seen as a volatile producer. It's hard to rely on Libyan production going forward. So international oil companies, obviously, they can't invest. They won't invest. It's too much of a risky market for them. Yet Libya still controls significant volumes of crude, proven reserves that will probably never be produced. Because for countries like Libya, the clock is ticking to the point where when we get to peak oil demand, will markets actually want the oil? So then the question becomes, what impact does that have on the politics of these fragile oil-producing countries? And Libya is just one of them.
Well, Andy, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
This has been a Seek and Prosper interview from S&P Global. Please watch our other interviews in the series. Thank you.